Welcome to In His Grip with Dr. Chuck F. Betters of markinc.org. Visit markinc.org, where you'll discover many free resources, videos, devotionals, and more that will equip you to walk by faith and offer help and hope. You can also find out about our online biblical counseling service. That's markinc.org.
Turn to the book of Judges. Judges, the 6th chapter. What I thought we would do today and perhaps over the next couple of weeks is to try to give a specific example of how the grace of God brings about this kind of renewal. We, I think, are very guilty in the church today of a man-centeredness in our religion. Even good evangelical Christians, well-meaning Bible-believing Christians, myself included, all of us, sometimes we fall into the trap of reading these wonderful stories of Scripture, and we tend to think to ourselves, I need to be like that. For example, we will read the book of Judges. We'll come to the 6th, the 7th, and the 8th chapters of Judges, which speak of the story of Gideon. And when we come to the story of Gideon, we do this even in our Sunday schools at times. Our Sunday school literatures are packed with stories about Gideon and Deborah and Ruth and many of the other Old Testament examples. And we look at these people and we say, I need to be like that. I need to be like Gideon. I've entitled this message, From Fear to Faith. Conversion from fear to faith. I think you will find that as this story unfolds, the last person in the world you want to be like is Gideon. As heroic as he is, he's even in the Hall of Fame. They retired his number in Hebrews 11, along with many of the others. Even though we hear this story and read this story, I want you to resist with every ounce of spiritual energy within you the temptation to draw this conclusion, I need to be like Gideon. Because that's not the essence of the message. There is a conversion taking place. And the one who is effecting this conversion clearly is God Himself. And so the focus ought not to be on Gideon. It ought to be on the wonderful grace of God. The book of Judges was written to show us cycles of Israel's 350-year period of history. After the death of Joshua, Israel had no king. There were no leaders. There were no prophets. When Joshua is buried, the lands had been conquered. There was no real leader. Israel was kind of dispersed into little colonies, a little pocket of power here and a little pocket of power there. And as the book of Judges unfolds, it unfolds in cycles. The cycle begins with God raising up a deliverer. He sees His people in bondage. He sees them in rebellion. He sees them in apostasy, and so He raises them from that apostasy by bringing out a deliverer. In the book of Judges, they were called judges. The judges form leadership or provide leadership, and through their leadership and through the counsels of God and through the power of God, Israel is brought from captivity to deliverance. But then they fall right back into apostasy. And the cycle repeats itself. God again raises up another deliverer, brings them out of their apostasy, delivers them from the hands of their enemies, and then the cycle again repeats itself. And the book of Judges is like that all the way through. It's interesting that if you go to the very last chapter, of the book of Judges, the very last verses, tell you that every man does what is right in his own eyes. And thus the stage is set for God to provide the kingship for the people of God that would ultimately bring birth to the Lord Jesus Christ himself. So you see where we are in the book of Judges is we are between two great eras. On the one hand, we have the conquest of Canaan. We have the great leader of Joshua and Moses and the Exodus, bringing the people out, the covenant people out, and the conquest of the land of Canaan. The land had been divvied up. And then on the other hand, on the other side of the bookends, you have the kingship and the formation of the Davidic dynasty, and so Israel's history is going to continue. But in between, you have this 350-year period of cycles of apostasy and deliverance, apostasy and deliverance, apostasy and deliverance. Judges 6 through 8 is one of those cycles, and it speaks of the ministry of Gideon. As you read this, I want you to resist very carefully the temptation to say to yourself, I need to be Gideon. The question is, how are we then converted from paralyzing fear to power-packed faith? That's the story of Judges 6 through 8. That's the story of Gideon. As the 6th chapter opens, you have Israel in their fourth oppression, their fourth cycle. At this time, it's at the hand of the Midianites. And there were two other groups that assisted the Midianites in persecuting Israel. You had on the one hand the Amalekites. They were the ones, if you remember, attacked Israel when Israel came up out of Egypt. And then there was a second group that we just know of them as the children of the East, a desert people who lived east of South Canaan. So you have the Amalekites, you have the Midianites, and you have these children of the East surrounding Israel. All of this takes place in around 1170 BC and lasted 7 years, followed by 40 years of peace. All of it takes place in the valley of Jezreel, the same place where Deborah and Barak effected through the power of God another deliverance, another cycle where the people of God experienced great blessing. It was a very fertile land. It was an agriculturally centered land. It was where good crops could be raised. It was where good herds could be raised. Now, if you go to Judges chapter 6, you're going to catch the character or the flavor of this period. Verse 1, Judges 6. Again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. And for 7 years he gave them into the hands of the Midianites. Because the power of Midian was so oppressive, the Israelites prepared shelters for themselves in mountain clefts, caves, and strongholds. Whenever the Israelites planted their crops, catch this now, the Midianites, the Amalekites, and other eastern peoples invaded the country. They camped on the land and ruined the crops all the way to Gaza and did not spare a living thing for Israel, neither sheep, nor cattle, nor donkeys. They came up with their livestock and their tents like swarms of locusts. It was impossible to count the men and their camels. They invaded the land to ravage it. Midian so impoverished the Israelites, they cried out to the Lord for help. Now you got the picture? You've got these Jewish people raising the crops. They were the food supply for the area. No sooner would they come to harvest, Midian, Amalek, and these other eastern people would invade Israel and pillage their crops. Here you have a picture of a people in absolute despair. a humiliating picture of judgment and hopelessness, a picture of weakness and paralyzing fear. Israel had to hide in caves. By the way, always a sign of being under the curse in the Old Testament is this kind of paralysis. Each year, 135,000, we know that from chapter 8 and verse 10, human locusts, like John Deere harvesters, stripped Israel bare of her crops. And they were absolutely helpless and powerless to do anything about it. We know that the Amalekites were savage barbarians. They were terrorists, cruel, unusually cruel people. The Midianites were really the apostate descendants of Moses' in-laws. They were the ones who sent their women into Israel's camp in order to seduce the Israelites to sin. A cruel, wicked people. We know very little about these children from the East, except that they had access to a new military weapon. That new military weapon was the camel. It was around this time they discovered that camels served a very useful purpose as military weapons. You have to wonder about that. Well, first of all, they were ugly enough to scare the Israelites to death, but they were mobile, long-range, swift animals. And when you thought that the enemy was far, far away and could not traverse the distance, they would ride these camels into battle and surprise the foot soldiers. They could travel for 300 miles for 3 to 4 days with heavy loads on them with no food and no water. Quite a beast. And so you have the Amalekites, you have the Easternites, you have the Midianites, and you have impoverished, helpless Israel raising the food for them to come and take. In the midst of all of this, the character of Gideon is introduced. Look at verse 7. Gideon, verse 7, Judges chapter 6. When the Israelites cried to the Lord because of Midian, he sent them a prophet who said, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says." Now watch this. I brought you up out of Egypt, out of the hand of slavery. I snatched you from the power of Egypt and from the hand of all your oppressors. I drove them from before you and gave you their land. I said to you, I am the Lord your God. Do not worship the gods of the Amorites in whose land you live, but you have not listened to me. All the way through that passage, there's an emphasis on one word. What is it? I. And at the very end, after saying, I did this, and I did this, and I did this, he points to them and said, and you did this. Very clearly illustrating for us why Israel was in this kind of oppression. Paralyzed. Paralyzed. Kind of a two-point sermon to show why they were suffering so much. What God had done, point number one, in bringing them out of Egypt, and point number two, their apostasy and their fear. Notice verse 7, he says, because of the Midianites, when the Israelites cried to the Lord, because of Midian. You see, their cry unto God was not because of their sin. Their cry to God was because of the pain. They were not a repentant people crying unto the Lord for deliverance. They were a fear-packed people, paralyzed in their own apostasy, crying out to God because the Midianites were so tough. You know, sometimes we don't get the message, do we? Sometimes God, in many, many different ways, tries to bring to bear a particular message in our lives. We just don't get the message. Well, then if you drop down to verse 11, see something taking place here. The Lord turned to him and said. The Lord turned to Gideon and said. Now, I want you to note something here. Verse 11. The angel of the Lord, that's a theophany. A theophany means a pre-incarnational appearance of Jesus. This is none other than Jesus Christ. This is not any angel. This is the angel of the Lord. This is a pre-incarnation appearance of Jesus Christ. The angel of the Lord came and sat down under the oak in Ophrah that belonged to Joash, who was Gideon's father. And there Gideon was threshing wheat in the winepress to keep it from the Midianites. Now catch this picture. You want to be like Gideon? Well, catch this picture. He knows the Amalekites and the Midianites and the Easterners are out there, and they're ready, waiting for the harvest. There were two ways to prepare your wheat. One was out in public at the threshing floor. The other was in private at the winepress. Now here you have the picture of Gideon literally secluded, pounding away at his dough, making his bread in hiding and in fear of the Amalekites. His father Joash is now brought into this picture, and we're going to hear a little bit more about Joash in just a moment. The people, his relatives, his uncles, his aunts, his brothers, his sisters, are all apostate. There are no believers to be found. Now God appears, Christ appears to Gideon in this absolutely helpless estate, totally bound up by fear, living amongst an apostate people. The angel of the Lord appears to Gideon and says in verse 12, "You are a mighty warrior." Say what? Now, you're an observer. You're standing there watching this. Well, now, Lord, that man looks like he's got his tail tucked between his legs to me. He looks scared, oppressed, spiritually bankrupt, faithless, and paralyzed. Why are you calling him a mighty warrior? The first words of Christ to Gideon are so ridiculous. The Lord is with you, you mighty man of valor, another text would tell us. Literally, by the way, the literal translation of that word warrior is one who marches into the teeth of the enemy. Gideon, from my perspective, you are one who marches right into the teeth of the enemy. You know, other people may look at your flaws. Other people may look at your failings. But I believe God views us through His Son. I believe when He looks at me in my faithless paralysis and looks at you in your fear-packed vacuum in which you live. I believe when He looks at us as we have our spiritual tails tucked between our legs, I believe as Christian people He looks beyond us to the power of Jesus Christ in us. And it is from that perspective that He says, you can march into the teeth of the enemy. You can face this head on. You may not feel like it. You may not look like it. You may not even have the equipment to do it, but in my strength and power, you are a mighty warrior. You may not feel like one this morning. You may have been beaten up, chewed up, and spit out. You may be sitting here as nothing more than a fragment of somebody else's dust. You may be sitting here nothing more, nothing less than impotent and powerless spiritually. You look at what you are facing or what you have faced, and you say, Lord, I can't do it. You're well on the road to spiritual recovery the moment you say that. You see, the whole of this message is going to focus not on you, Him. You did this, but I did this, and I did this, and I did this. But you're a mighty warrior, He says. Now, very carefully, I want you to note verse 13. But, sir, Gideon replied. If the Lord is with us, why has this all happened to us? Question number one. Question number two. Where are all his wonders that our fathers told us about when they said, did he not bring us up out of Egypt? I hear about these things. I hear about other people who have wonderful victories. I hear about the power of God in other people's lives. I hear about the great deliverances and the miracles that God is working in other people, but how come it's not happening to me? Question one, if you're with me, why is this happening? Question two, how come others experience great miracles and I don't? Notice what he says thirdly. But now the Lord has abandoned us, put us into the hand of men. Okay, let's be like Gideon. Right? You want to be like that? The sad part is, that's exactly how we are. That's exactly how we are. We are just like that. Oh, if, why, where, now, deliver. But God sits through all of that. Notice he doesn't say, well, you get rid of all those flaws, and then I'll love you. You get all those questions answered, Mr. Gideon, and then I'll come back and talk to you later. You sift through all that heretical garbage, Gideon, and I'll put my arms around you and hold you in my grip. You know, the Reformation was built around doctrines. We call them sola scriptura, scripture alone. Sola fide, faith alone. Sola gratia, grace alone. You know what we have done with those doctrines? We have a new one, sola bootstrappa. Pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. Be like Gideon. That's not the message of this passage. Thank God he didn't say to Gideon, I'll love you and hold you in my grip when you get all your questions answered, when you express all those doubts and theologically answer them. No, Gideon, it goes beyond all of that. He doesn't say, I'll use you, and I'll use you as a deliverer, and I'll make your name great, and I'll put you in the Hall of Fame in Hebrews 11 when you get it all together, buddy. No, my weaknesses, my paralyzing fear, your weaknesses and your paralyzing fear, listen to me, they become the very means by which we experience the transforming grace of Almighty God. It's when we think we're strong that we block the grace of God. It's when we are weak that we become the vessels of the grace of God. Like that man who had a tremendous problem and went to the psychiatrist. And he says, Doctor, you know, you need to help me. Everything's going wrong. I feel worthless. And you know, doctor, my friends tell me that I have a terrible inferiority complex. Can you help me? The psychiatrist runs all these tests and evaluations, and a week later calls the man back into his office. He says, friend, I've got some good news. I've got some bad news. He says, the good news is we have found that you don't have a complex. The bad news is you are definitely inferior. You'll get it. Hang in there. Well, that's kind of how Gideon felt. I'm ugly today, but I'm going to be used of God tomorrow. But see, Gideon was not at that stage yet. He said, I'm ugly today, but I'm going to be ugly tomorrow. And I'm going to be ugly the next day. And I'm going to be ugly the next day. Why? Because God, you've forsaken me. I hear about the miracles in others, but I haven't experienced any myself. I hear these great stories of Bible deliverance, but I haven't experienced any myself. I hear about the faith in others, but I don't have faith myself. So I'm ugly today. I'm going to be ugly tomorrow. That's how Gideon felt. You know, I heard a little girl once say, her mother was reading some Bible stories. Mother told me, she said, you know what my daughter said? Mommy, how come the people in the Bible were more exciting than us? How come their faith was more exciting than ours? We hear about this wonderful power. We hear about great revivals. We hear about the outpouring of God's Spirit. But we sit around with our thumbs in our mouths, pins in our chests, paralyzed fear. But look at verse 14. After expressing all that doubt, turning his anger against God, verse 14, the Lord turned to him. Now, I don't want to make too much out of that word turn, but there is etymological evidence as you study that word. There's some evidence that while Gideon was saying all these things, the Lord was kind of turned sideways. He was kind of looking off in this direction, listening with a tolerating ear. But then the turning involves a gazing. It involves a staring. It involves a blazing look. It involves a penetrating glance into the heart of this man. He gazes on him. He turns and he looks on him. Notice what he says. He fixes his gaze. Now, I got to tell you something. I think Gideon knew at this point something was up. Gideon's complaint was frustration born out of an overburdened heart that had become paralyzed by fear. Notice what he says in verse 14. Go in the strength you have. And I got to tell you something. I am so glad that verse doesn't end there. King James Version says, go in this your strength. New American Standard says, go in this your strength. Well, that sounds like be like Gideon now, doesn't it? That sounds like we ought to be like Gideon. Go in this your strength. Sola bootstrappa. Pull yourself up here, buddy. Go in this your strength. But the verse doesn't end there. He says, and save Israel out of Midian's hands. Am I not sending you? Verse 16. I will be with you, and you will strike down the Midianites as if they were one man. Notice where his strength lies. Go in this your strength, and then God defines the strength. The strength that Gideon possessed was not inherent. The strength that Gideon possessed was in the very presence of God in his life. It was God's presence that became his strength. It was God's grace that became his strength. It was in God's power, in God's time, in the faithfulness of God's Spirit that Gideon would effect this deliverance. You don't have the strength. Hudson Taylor used to say, all of God's great men have been weak men who have done great things because they reckoned on his being with them. They counted on his faithfulness. You get that? Listen again. All of God's great men have been weak men who have done great things because they reckoned on his being with them. They counted on his faithfulness. I want to tell you, I think that's what's missing in our lives. And I think that's why we exist in this vacuum of fear. That's why we live back here on verse 13. That's why we live in that kind of an environment that says, Lord, why have you done this? If you are with us, why are these things happening to me? Lord, if you were here, why am I hearing of great miracles in others? Lord, you have abandoned me. You have abandoned me. You have abandoned me. Because you see, all of that is I, me. God says to Gideon, go in this your strength, and here's your strength. My presence will go with you. My Spirit will go with you. My Spirit will go before you. And you know the rest of the story is proof that there's no conceivable way Gideon could have effected this deliverance apart from the miraculous intervention of the presence of God. Now, notice verse 15. But Lord, Gideon asked, how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh. Now, and I'm the weakest of the weak. You know, I belong to this family, Lord. They're the weakest of all the families around. And in that family, I'm the weakest of all of them. I think he may have been saying, at least in his mind at that point, I think he may have been standing back and saying, Lord, have you noticed where I am? I'm in a cave. I'm in hiding. Have you looked outside? There's 135,000 people ready to take all of my food from me, ready to pillage our land. Lord, my family is powerless. In fact, Lord, I want you to go one step further and take a look at my dad. My dad, Joash, is one of the leaders of this Baal movement. My dad is an idolater. My dad used to be spiritual. My dad now is an idolater. He's got the whole clan bowing down to these Canaanite gods. Have you looked around, Lord? Gideon asked, how can I save Israel? My clan's the weakest in Manasseh. I'm the least of my family. The Lord answered, I. Notice that emphasis on that word again. I will be with you, and you will strike down the Midianites as if they were one man. Gideon replied, if now I have found favor in your eyes, give me a sign. Give me a sign. Well, you know, the man's standing there, feeling what he felt, paralyzed by this fear. Somebody's talking to him that's apparently not human, apparently not. I mean, what would you do? What would you do? He says, you know, you need to prove this, that you're who you say you are. Give me a sign. Well, when all else fails, what do? Seek a sign. When all else fails, seek a sign. Literally, by the way, that word means miraculous sign. That it's really you talking with me, literally is that you are really God as you say you are God. You know, don't criticize too quickly Gideon at this point. I think I probably would have asked the same question. I think you would have too. Are you really who you say you are? Now, Gideon has a plan. He's got a plan in mind. Verse 18. He says, please do not go away until I come back and bring my offering and set it before you. And the Lord said, I will wait until you return. Now, there's a whole sermon on that. There's a whole sermon on that verse. I'll wait until you return. Aren't you glad he says that? Aren't you glad he said that? When we go off into our little binges of heresy, when we begin to shake our fist in God's face, I think he kind of turns sideways, but he never turns away from it. And we move off into these little pockets or avenues of apostasy and rebellion and questioning our faith and questioning God and questioning the scriptures and wondering why we can't have the same things that other people have, why we're hit with so many problems, so many complexities. Lord, when are you going to hear my cry? And the Lord's just turning there sideways and says, I'll be here when you get back. Take your little journey. Take your little tour. And when you're ready, you come on back, and I'll be here. Because you see, you can't get there until you go through me first. Now, sometimes I think the Lord even stands back and says, go ahead. Go right ahead. I know of many people who married the wrong person because the Lord stepped back and said, you're so bent on this? Go ahead. Go ahead. And they live in the consequences of bad decisions that they did not rely in faith upon his directive. And God says, go ahead. And when all hell breaks loose in their lives, literally, they return back to God and he never moved an inch. He's in the same place that he was when you abandoned him. We make financial decisions based on materialism and ego and pride. God says, go ahead. We make emotional decisions. We say things We do things. We engage in things. How many men and how many women today had one sexual experience outside of their marriages who now carry the AIDS virus? How many? Even Christian people who years ago made a wrong move. God stands back and says, you must now live with those consequences. However, when your life comes apart and you feel as though nobody has gripped you, that nobody loves you, I'm going to be standing right here in the same spot where you forsook me, and when you come back, I'll hold you in my grip. I'm so glad. You notice what he says there in verse 18. He says, please don't go away until I come back and bring my offering. The Lord answered, I'll wait until you. Gideon went in, prepared a young goat, and from an ephah of flour, which, by the way, was about a 6-foot-high barrel of flour. Now, flour was very precious. This man was kneading that flour the hard way. So you've got this 6-foot barrel of flour. I mean, Gideon really went into the kitchen to prepare a top-notch sacrifice. And when you put the details of this sacrifice together, he got a goat, an ephah of flour, bread without yeast. He even made it unleavened bread. He put the meat in a basket and the broth in a pot, and he brought them all out and offered them under the oak tree. So he brings this sacrifice. And by the way, it was a sacrifice. Food was rare. Food was a very rare commodity. And so he brings this ephah of flour. Now that's a lot of dough. That's a vessel large enough to hold a human being in it. A lot of threshing with that puny little stick. And this rare pleasure called bread, and even unleavened bread. The bread of the Exodus, and a young goat, a kid. Generous and rare was a young kid. Now you come to verse 20. The angel of God said to him, take the meat, take the unleavened bread, place them on this rock, and pour out the broth. Gideon did so. Now remember what all this is supposed to accomplish. Are you really God? Are you really God? Gideon did so with the tip of the staff that was in his hand. The angel of the Lord touched the meat and the unleavened bread. Fire flared from the rock, consuming the meat and the bread, and the angel of the Lord disappeared. You want to talk about a flame-boiling experience. Christ touched sacrifice. Gideon looks around, and he's by himself again. He's alone. That rock became an altar upon which God demonstrated to Gideon what restored communion is all about. That is, God's transforming presence had begun its work. Gideon was now being moved from paralyzing faith, and God was going to convert him from paralyzing fear to genuine faith by his presence. In Gideon, verse 22, when Gideon realized that it was the angel of the Lord, he exclaimed, "Ah, sovereign Lord, I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face. I'm going to die." When you come into contact with the face of God, you will die. And when that sacrifice was consumed and he looked around and the Lord was not there anymore, Gideon began to think to himself, I am dead meat. I'm just as dead as that sacrifice. I have seen the Lord face to face. I'm going to die. Was he wrong in saying that? No, he was absolutely right. When in our fallen condition, we look face to face into the eyes of God, we are dead men. The only reason why Gideon would live to tell the tale is because God would extend to him grace. That's what the cross is all about. That's what Jesus Christ is all about. In our lost, paralyzed condition, we stand face to face and look into the eyes of a holy God. We are dead men. By the mediatorial work of Jesus Christ, we can behold the glory of God and live not because of us, but because of Him. Is there any greater glory than that? Is there any greater hope than that? First act of the Spirit was to revive sinfulness. That's the first step in the process of being translated out of paralyzing fear, sanctifying faith. You've got to realize who you are. You've got to realize your own sinfulness. When someone claims to have experienced God's presence, something is always going to happen. We are going to experience God's presence when we experience our own sinfulness. Dawn of a new beginning for Gideon. He is now beginning to experience what it means to be transformed by the grace of God. By the way, when you jump ahead, this wonderful, wonderful deliverance that God effects, guess how the story ends? Gideon's right back into apostasy, right back into failure, even after the mighty deliverance of God in his life. I don't want to be like that. Do you? Do you want to live the rest of your life asking God why, if only, if you could, if you would? Or are you willing to bow down and say, Lord, touch down here in my life? If it leaves a scorch mark, it leaves a scorch mark. But that scorch mark will be a reminder of your glory in my life. So far in this story, everything's between God and Gideon. This is God dealing with Gideon privately. Privately. You see, the next chapter, he's going to make it public. The next chapter, he's going to make it worldwide. But as you read each verse, a message is driven home again, again, and again. It is not in your strength. It is not in your power. It is not in your energy. It is in Him that you can ever hope any kind of deliverance brings about transformation and genuine.
You've been listening to Dr. Chuck F. Betters in this program brought to you by MarkInc.org, proclaiming the truth that God is sovereign and you can trust Him. Please visit us online at MarkInc.org to learn about other free resources, such as our Help and Hope personal stories addressing a variety of topics and difficult circumstances. Hear answers to tough questions about suffering and the sovereignty of God in our Ask Dr. Betters video series. Receive encouraging devotionals from Daily Treasure and more. Looking for help? We now offer online biblical counseling service through Anchored Hope Biblical Counseling, an online platform that will bring solid biblical counseling to those in need wherever and whenever they need it. Visit biblicalcounseling.online to make an appointment today.